Just wait for delegates to join us. Well, I think we'll make a start. So welcome everybody to this latest trust mediation webinar. Just some initial housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. For those who are live with us today, if you would like to participate, ask any questions or make any comments, please use the question and answer tab at the bottom of your screens, and we'll endeavour to answer them or respond to them towards the end of the webinar. Another piece of housekeeping for those who joined us on the last occasion, you may remember that our special guest then was Dr. Victoria McLeod, and she gave us a preview of what was going to be her last judgment, which she indicated pretty firmly would make some strident comments about dispute resolution and mediation. And that judgment was published a couple of days ago. It's Elphick and Times Media. Its reference is 2024 EWHC 2595. And as she rather previewed, one of her comments in that judgment says the following: any party which decides not to engage in ADR must be in a position to justify that non-engagement to the cost judge and be alert to the provisions of CPR 4411 and indeed the developing common law since Churchill. And if you want to listen in again to her talk, this is still available on our website at www.trustmediation.org.uk/webinar recordings. So with that as the background, today's topic is negotiation in mediations. I looked up what the definition of negotiation was, and I was told it was a dialogue between two or more parties to resolve points of difference, gain an advantage, or craft outcomes to satisfy various interests. The parties aspire to agree on matters of mutual interest. Key components are therefore: what are the issues? Why do the parties take up their respective positions? And how do the parties see their differences being reconciled? Today's seminar isn't a chalk and talk seminar, it's a discussion. And I'm delighted to have been joined by three really experienced mediation practitioners, all from a different angle, all with a different background. And I'd particularly like to welcome Jennifer Harris, our special guest today. Jennifer is a solicitor of 14 years, legal director at Capsticks, and as Capsticks are proud to publish on their website, known for her empathetic approach to negotiations in mediation. She's the Capsticks ADR liaison officer, a post that we hope most firms now have, and certainly makes life easy for us at Trust Mediation to contact consumers of our dispute resolution services having such a post. Jennifer, you're very welcome. And I'd like to also introduce one of our newest mediators at Trust Mediation, Elizabeth Francis. Many of you will know her as counsel at Atlantic Chambers in Liverpool, 20 years specialist in clinical negligence, and very experienced in her role as mediation advocate and learning the ropes as qualified mediator, able to currently mediate non-NHS cases, but very shortly, we hope, NHS resolution approved. And finally, someone who really needs no introduction, but I'll introduce him anyway, my colleague director at Trust Mediation, Brian Dawson, former senior partner of Walker Smith & Way, and then head of clinical negligence at Slater and Gordon in Chester. Now, when he's not mediating, deputy district judge in the Northwest region. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at negotiation in mediation. And it's only right I start with our special guest, Jenny. Jenny, what do you see as an empathetic defendant, your role in presenting your client's point of view in a mediation, and what help can you see the claimant side helping you formulate your offers?
Thanks, Paul, and thank you everyone for having me here. Yeah, mediation is, from our perspective, and certainly from the client's perspective, obviously majority of clinical negligence matters on behalf of NHS resolution. And the focus is very much on reaching fast and fair resolution as quickly as possible, but also importantly about keeping both patients, families and clinicians out of the courtroom. And that's why we have found that mediation is a really useful way to do that. But also importantly in trying to rebuild trust between that patient and actually the NHS. When they've had a horrible experience where there's been negligence involved, it can be really challenging, particularly if there's continuing care, for that relationship to continue. And so mediation is something we find is a really useful way of giving the patient that opportunity, the claimant that opportunity to express their experience of the process, to have that heard in a very deliberate way. And then to obviously have those negotiations to try and reach that compromise. So in terms of sort of what can help us to get there and to help us do that in the most productive way, certainly from our perspective, it needs to be, as has always been intended in these processes, but is for it to be cards on the table approach. Whilst we always have a client available so that we can seek authority to adapt and move depending on the information that's shared and the progress that's being made, I'm sure you can appreciate that it's a big animal, the NHS resolution, and also NHS more generally. And so it's not always possible for us to get instructions on the flip of a coin or as quickly as we might like. And so certainly a lot of preparation needs to go into making sure that we can answer the evidence that the claimants put forward, because obviously at the end of the day, they want to understand why we are saying that that case is of a certain value, for example. And we want to make sure that there can be that exchange so that both parties are coming fully aware. There's no issue of ambush. There's no Perry Mason moments, if anyone's old enough online to know who that is, but running in with a new piece of paper or a new, document or report last minute in an aim to sort of have a coup. This is intended to be a very collaborative process, and part of that is ensuring that we can get those preemptive steps. A lot of work happens, as you know, Paul, before we even get into the mediation in terms of preparing for that. So I think from a defendant perspective, it's about agreeing realistic timescales around when a claimant might be able to disclose some evidence on the WP without prejudice basis, and allowing time for the defendant to be able to do that in response, or to provide a position statement, for example, that will help guide the claimant in understanding what, managing their expectations around what might be available. And that, all of that sets up towards the best possible, most productive mediation in my experience.
Oh, thanks, Jennifer. Well, let me turn to Elizabeth then. long-time claimant advocate. How do you prepare your clients for mediation, bearing in mind that, as Brian will no doubt confirm, he and I quite often have claimants who appear in the claimant room and at some stage in the process will say to us, "Oh, Paul, it's not about money." And with the other hand say, "Well, I've just given away £500,000. You can't expect me to give away any more."
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. As Jennifer said, good advanced preparation, it has to be key here. You're always going to find out something new on the day. That tends to be the way that mediations work. So you have to be prepared for that and open-minded to that. But knowing exactly where you are in advance and helping your client to understand their case and manage their expectations is absolutely key. You'll no doubt have a schedule that's been prepared either by yourself or by your instructing solicitor. And it's really important to obviously make sure that your client understands that schedule and also what is likely to be achievable from that schedule, and their understanding that it's not, they're not going to get that final figure on the last page of the schedule. And of course, sometimes it can take a little bit longer to get that message across. And that can be a real joint effort between solicitors and barristers to do so. Sometimes you get a refreshing client that's, like you say, absolutely understands that although, of course, money is near on always going to be a significant part of it for any claimant, there are other aspects to it. So it's getting that balance and understanding the individualities of your own client, because they're all so different. I think that leads also quite well into consideration of the extrajudicial remedies that might become available to you through the mediation process. And that's why, again, we love mediation, because you have so many alternative options available to you. We know that with a lot of claimants in clinical negligence claims, a lot of their desires are based in understanding things and being heard. And that can be an extremely good way of coming to a resolution that is not always all about the money. And again, that can be a process. It's a moving feast throughout the mediation, but keeping your client's mind on not just the money can be extremely helpful, and working with the defendant to see what can be done with those extrajudicial types of remedies, you know, can really keep the momentum of the mediation going. I think disclosure is so important, because if at the end of the day, a mediation is all about shifting your opponent's risk assessment of the case, because they've already seen what they've seen, they've already got their ideas, and they've already got their opinions on what the value might be. And you want to be in the strongest position possible to get them to adjust that risk assessment. And if that is through disclosing more documentation on a without prejudice basis. We have to remember it's without prejudice, it's confidential, it's an entirely safe space to do all of these things at an early stage. And that could be really early on in the whole process. This could even be pre-issue. And I think a lot of parties are very reluctant to consider disclosure. And we all know that nothing is ever perfect. But I think it's important to be open, and to use that sort of collaborative approach, and yeah, as part of the preparations. But one final thing actually that I really wanted to say was use the pre-mediation chat with the mediator to your advantage. You know, get the mediator to work during that pre-chat. Bounce ideas around, ask them what they think of what you've done so far, what you might have disclosed so far, what's in your position statement so far, and ask them what else they might think could be useful here. You don't have to go with what they say, but it's a really good way of making sure you've really prepared well for it so that you can get the most out of the day.
Brian, preparation's already come up, and Elizabeth mentioned the pre-mediation call. Can you just explain how you as mediator can help the parties prepare for the negotiations that are to take place?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I was going to start by saying that the one thing that's perhaps a problem with this particular presentation is that the two people who are here speaking on behalf of the claimant and the defendant respectively know the system extremely well. And so, we as mediators would endorse every single word they've said, but it comes across in droves that you guys obviously are very experienced in the system. But yes, so we don't have to add too much. In terms of a pre-mediation, there are many things that you can achieve in the pre-mediation conversation. The first thing, obviously, is to introduce yourself. I also find, by the way, that if before the mediation you can somehow speak to the clients themselves, not necessarily so much with NHS resolution, because obviously they're professionals and we've seen them before, but particularly the lay client, if there's some way you can arrange to speak to them, whether on video or otherwise, I find that helps to do several things. One, get the initial chat out of the way so they understand in our words what a mediation is about, but secondly, so that they can perhaps be a little bit more comfortable and a little bit less nervous about the day. So far as the representatives are concerned, again, it's taking them through the process if you haven't worked with them before. Particularly, I find it's important to ascertain a number of crucial issues. One is, what is the defendant intending to achieve by that, what the insurer, the NHS are intending to achieve? Are they there to make an offer, or are they, and this is all in confidence, I preface everything I say by the expression that the most important part of any mediation or relationship between the mediator and both sides is the bit where we say everything you say to us remains in confidence, of course. But in confidence, what's the defendant's approach? Are they there to make an offer? Or even if it's eventually, if they need to, or are they there simply to listen, or have they got instructions to make no offers at all? Now, often defendants won't have that information too far before the mediation, but it's essential that when they do get it, if they're there just to listen or with no intention of making an offer, that is made clear to the claimant, because otherwise when the claimant arrives expecting an offer, it can set things back considerably if they hear that's not the case. The other thing that I think is really important, because, and you touched on this, Elizabeth, is documentation. It can be quite frustrating to get to a mediation and find that documents aren't available that are really crucial to resolving the issues. And the mediator therefore has an opportunity to find out if there's anything outstanding and then help by liaising with the other side in confidence or otherwise, to make sure that all the documents are there that both sides need. They're obviously to make the arrangements for the mediation, but also, Paul, to talk through what the approach of both sides, what they hope to achieve, and as Elizabeth said, to start helping to plan. One of the many things you said that was music to my ears was that you can bounce around ideas with a mediator, and I know Paul will agree with me that years ago there was a slight tendency for people to say nothing, or try and say nothing, to hold the cards close to the chest and say, I want you to go and say this. Nowadays, we as mediators will say, and have a lot more success, I hope, in working with people, saying, look, work with us. We're here to help. We're not here to ambush your strategy. We're here to help you implement it. So, chat over with us what your strategy is, where you want to go, how you intend to get there, and where we can help. Particularly, and again, I think it was Jennifer who mentioned this, in terms of the client. If you've got a client who might be a little bit more reluctant to accept what you say than others, then it can be really helpful to have a third party who can help you with that reality checking or risk assessment, and so that the client really understands the issues involved and the realistic parameters and has their expectations managed. Paul and I will both have experiences of going in, particularly in big cases, where there's been a schedule of a couple of million or something, but actually the realistic expectation is about 700,000. I'm just picking figures out of the air there. But if that hasn't been fully explained to the client, if they're not on board first with all that, then there's a grieving process. You get to the mediation, the counsel says, "Oh, you're not going to get that. I mean, we'll start with this and see where we go." There's a client isn't just going to say, "Oh, okay, then I'll just write off $1 million. I didn't realise I had to do that." There's a grieving process that needs to be gone through, and all those issues in confidence can be explored prior to the mediation. And Paul, in order that people don't get fed up with my voice, I'm going to hand over to you to carry on. But you know,
well, I was going to fast forward this because I think everyone's dealt with the pre-mediation preparation, but a subject that intrigues me, and I find myself quite often having to start off mediations, mediating this problem. Who makes the first offer? And I just wondered if I could have a view. I'll start off with Elizabeth. Who makes the first offer? I mean, I had one advocate suggest to me pretty strongly that it was a sign of weakness if you made the first offer. Let's see what your experience is.
I think there are a lot of traditional views around there, not just that making the first offer is a sign of weakness, sometimes that mediating in itself is a sign of weakness, and we very much need to move away from that. And we're being told we have to now as well, which is great. But yeah, making the first offer, I mean, it's a real art in a way to judge when you're starting with your offers and what you're starting at, and part of making the first offer may be part of that. If offers have already been traded, that makes life easier, because it tends to be, you know, the person who's made the last offer is not going to then necessarily be prepared to, or I would necessarily encourage them to make the first offer in a mediation, because I think, you know, it's the sub saying, you know, the ball is in the other party's court because you've made an offer. So it's their turn at the start of the mediation to come back with the counter offer. And that can be orchestrated, you know, plan that in advance. By all means, make sure that you've made an offer that's on the table before the mediation starts, so that your first experience of the mediation is waiting for the other side to come back. So you're getting a flavour of where they're at. Where you haven't had any trading of an offers prior to the mediation, then I think people can start to feel a little bit uncomfortable making the first move. But I think that's where the skill of their advocate and the mediator comes in, to encourage them that they don't need to feel it's the sign of weakness, but actually it's a strength in getting the ball moving. And you know what, we're all here to achieve a settlement today. So let's get over our personal foibles, and hopefully we've got a plan of action. Hopefully you've mapped out some starting points and the moves that you hope to make within the mediation, of course leaving wriggle room for having some of your views changed by what you might hear by the other side, from the other side in the mediation. But I think too much posturing at the beginning can simply lead to a lot of frustration and putting people's backs up. And at the end of the day, somebody's just got to go for it. And if you've got an awkward person on the other side that's not going to break the ice and not going to get on with it, then I often say to my client, look, if they're going to play that game, doesn't mean we have to play that game. So let's crack on. It doesn't mean to say, and we might come on to discuss that, it doesn't mean to say that first move has to be some sort of huge leap. It's just about getting the ball rolling.
Okay, Jennifer, what do you think of that response from Elizabeth? And I'm quite intrigued at the issue as well of this huge leap. You know, is it best to create the atmosphere for an advocate to consider making the big leap first, or do you think it's more effective coming later on? How do you judge it?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's going to sound like a typical lawyer answer, isn't it? It depends. But I say that because I think Elizabeth's absolutely right. Firstly, we have to get over the fact that we're here to collaborate and we're here to resolve. And the reality is this is a first offer. It's not a last offer, so we know it's a starting point. But I do think we have to embrace the art of that first offer, in the sense that it can obviously dictate a mood for how negotiations will go. So, for example, knocking £20 off your schedule and making an offer that's basically a full pleaded value is not going to encourage collaboration or swift moving in terms of negotiations. So I think it needs to be a realistic first offer. Certainly, I think defendants largely accept that they're probably going to go first, because there is this historical sort of view from claimants that they feel quite uncomfortable making the first concession. But I do think that also depends sometimes on if, for example, liability is a live issue, whether we've got a very significant schedule, and for example, we've recently served a WP counter schedule in response, and perhaps there's a very big disparity in terms of valuations, then I think sometimes it can be really helpful if the claimant can go first to sort of indicate whether they are taking on board any of the points that the defendant has raised. And I think that can be quite conciliatory and sort of very positive in terms of encouraging then a similar response from sort of the defendant. I certainly know, and Paul, we've had this before where, for example, you know, we do appreciate it may not feel like it or seem like it when you're in your separate rooms, but we are genuinely taking on board what is happening on the day, what we hear on the day, refocusing, looking at what actually might be a claimant's priority and applying that to then the strategy in terms of the offer. And it might be, for example, a step we expected to make, we miss out because actually there's been really good progress made and we want that goodwill to continue, and actually, you know, we'll make a bigger move than perhaps was originally intended, in the hope of actually really showing that there is this intention to get to the right result at the end for everyone. So I do think people need to be less afraid of a first offer, because it is exactly that, and realise that really it is about showing an intention and setting a mood the same way as an opening session is, for example. So I think, as you say, Elizabeth, not playing games. I don't think it's not the environment, you know, it's never the environment, shouldn't be the environment at all, but it certainly shouldn't be when you're at a mediation. The aim is resolution. And so, you know, playing a game of coming down 20p from a Philippine schedule is just not going to set that tone. And all you're going to do is prolong it, which for your client, as Brian said, you know, there is a grieving process, however well briefed they are around where they've started and maybe where they might end up. It's also must be a very, and I'm sure Brian can talk to this and you, Paul, about how tiring it must actually be for the claimants, because they're taking in a lot in that day. It's very normal for us as lawyers to be talking about figures and discounts and how we're going to adjust it and what offers we want to make. But I'm sure for lay clients, it can be quite overwhelming. So I think, again, that's where sometimes just thinking about these things much more logically and trying to take the emotion out of it, or, you know, the competitiveness out of it, so that actually the focus is back on what the aim is, and that's resolution. And I think that can be really a positive thing.
Brian, Elizabeth made the comment about aggressive offers effectively creating an aggressive reaction from the other side. What can you, as a mediator, do when you're asked to take an offer, or you realise that what might be called an aggressive offer is going to be made? What can you do to try and...
I will come on to that. Can I just start by saying I agree with both parties. I just want to go back to what Jennifer said right at the start, which is, which I made a note of, which is to develop trust. In my view, a lot of negotiation, successful negotiation, has to do with credibility. And I think, and Jennifer hinted at this a minute ago, you know, we have to bear in mind all the time that, you know, if you are credible, then people will listen to you. If they think you're being unrealistic or not taking it seriously, they might not. And it can actually be counterproductive, and think the other side thinking, well, I'm wasting my time. I'm not going to go make the offers I would have done, because it's just pointless. So in terms of the first offer, I would ask people that, and it's not for me to dictate people's strategy, but I would ask you to ask, what are you trying to achieve? What are you afraid of, first of all? You know, people say, oh, well, you know, I'm afraid what if they accept? To which my view privately is, well, if you know this, again, take the $500,000, if you know this case is worth $500,000, and your first offer, instead of being $1.5 million, is more like 650, if they accept it, it's happy days, isn't it? But they're professionals, and so we know they probably won't. So we would say, obviously, two things. Firstly, if only quick wins, right at the start, the quick wins, you know, if there's something you know you're going to lose on, then concede it. It takes away their quick wins, and the other side's quick wins, and leaves them with just what they're worried about. But it creates credibility. And similarly with a first offer, it's not, again, I will take first offers eventually after we talked about them, and I'll come on to the question from Paul in a minute. But do bear in mind not just that the client's expectation, that if you're saying, oh, well, we'll do this, and do you agree to the client? You know, do you agree we offer on this $1.5 million, but we offer 1,350,000 and talking down to that? this kind of setting the expectation, and don't forget, I'm talking about a claim which we all know is worth £500,000 or something like that. So ask yourself, with any offer, I would suggest, what are you trying to achieve? And is this going to, and how is this going to help? So in answer to the question from Paul, which is a very relevant one, what do I do? I say, well, do you mind if we just discuss that before I go in there, and let's just talk it through, if I can understand why you're making that offer and why you're pitching it at that level, and perhaps talk it through with you. And I'm sure you would do the same, Paul. And then maybe, you know, ask them,
and ask them how is it going to be perceived in the other room?
Exactly. Would you accept it? So, and if you wouldn't accept it, if you were in their shoes, Paul, I think you made this point the other day when we were chatting. You know, one of the answers is to put yourselves in the other side's shoes. And a good question is, well, how would you receive it if you were in that room and you had that offer made to you? Yeah, absolutely, Paul.
Yeah. And then looking at the structure of offers, you know, there is no one model, and mediation itself is totally flexible. I can tell you, I conducted a mediation the other day when the case settled without anyone referring to schedules of losses at all. It was just a right number that each side had in their minds. But of course, that may well be the exception rather than the rule. So how do you, as a mediation advocate, Elizabeth, judge whether you make an offer that is just a figure or an offer for which you provide either background or justification, or even go through the schedule and say, well, we'll offer this, or we might go through the counter schedule and say, we accept argument A, B, and C, but D, E, F, we allocate different figures. Are you going to salami slice or just keep it general?
I've done both. And I think it's a case of judging where you're at with your client, how much they feel needs to be heard by the other side, what they feel needs to be said, because of course you're their advocate. They might have an opinion on this, and they might want to be heard on certain aspects that they feel very strongly about. In addition, I'll often respond to the way that my opponent wishes to play these things. If it's really important to my opponent to go through the heads of loss and everybody be heard in their individual arguments about various heads of loss, then I'm happy to do that as well. I've also been in joint settlement meetings and mediations where we've cut to the chase and we've only ever talked global figures. And sometimes, you know, sometimes that works. Sometimes it works brilliantly and it all goes smoothly and you think, gosh, that was refreshing. And sometimes you're there all day hammering out the minutiae of somebody's travel claim. But I don't, as I say, I don't mind doing either of those things. It tends to be what feels right for my client and what feels right for my opponent, because everybody's got to be heard and got to have their turn. I have to say, what you don't want to do is go over and over your schedule again and come back to that. You know, you've said your point, be that about travel or care or whatever. You say your point, you trust the other side has got that point and taken it on board. You don't need to go back and do that every time. So if you are sort of slicing through that schedule in your early discussions, put that to bed. And then by the end, you're dealing in numbers. I think that tends to be the more likely process.
Yeah. And Jennifer, from your point of view, are your clients, and let's take the NHS as your main client for this purposes, as the vast majority of mediations these days are NHS resolution based. From their point of view, from your point of view, does it matter whether you deal in round numbers or you have justification for each brick, if you like, in the settlement wall?
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo what Elizabeth said there about the personalisation aspect of it. So for some claimants, for example, there may be issues that are particularly important to them. So if we were talking about a fertility case, for example, a lot of priorities will be about their future treatment costs. And so I think then in those circumstances, sometimes it can be really important to make clear what's been allocated for that, so that they can understand or feel reassured that this offer is properly covering what is an actual priority to them. In which case, things like travel expenses and peripheral issues become less of a problem. They're just in the round then in terms of getting a resolution. I think sometimes it's necessary to break down some of the bigger heads of loss. I think really just to, again, manage expectations or reflect the evidence that each side has. I think that's also important from the advocate's perspective so that they can understand and advise their clients on whether that actual argument is reasonable or why it's not, so that then they can make that next step on an offer. But I think both sides advocates come prepared to have to break it down if required, because of course they've had to analyse it. But I do think it can quite often, if you get into too much minutiae after those initial sort of comments of, look, here are the 5 key things I think that we've got a difference over. This is what you say. This is why I don't agree. This is, you've seen our schedule for where we are. We're content to make some concessions in relation to that, or we accept there's a risk. And then to talk in general terms, because I think otherwise, if you do stick to the minutiae too much, then actually, as you say, you can get tangled up over the seemingly most irrelevant item and actually forgetting the bigger picture, which actually is how much globally will that offer be, rather than worrying about one specific head, which actually, as I say, in the round may sort of melt away if you looked at it as the bigger picture. So I think it's a balancing exercise around the difference between those issues that are a very key priority for a claimant, where they need to understand that that has been covered or not covered and why, versus actually keeping an eye on the bigger picture and making sure that that overall resolution is fair and compensates in the round to get it over the hill.
Brian, I don't know whether you'd like to come in and comment on any of that, but the other matter that I wanted to raise in this area was what happens if we as mediators get asked by someone in Jennifer's position, I'm not saying she'd ever do it, but someone in Jennifer's position, to put a global offer to a claimant, i.e. a cost inclusive
of
offer.
costs. Inclusive of costs.
Yeah.
Okay, well, yes, I would like to comment because, again, both of you, Jennifer and Elizabeth, both mentioned something vitally important, which we tend to forget, which is the client is at the centre of this process. And the comment I wanted to make, firstly, is absolutely agree that irrespective of whether it's helpful or not, if a client is an issue they particularly want to raise, this is their time to do it, and this is one of the benefits of mediation. So let them do it, and it may actually be persuasive if, as Jennifer said, if there's some issue that is particularly important to them, then it's certainly worth it. And also, a comment I'd make on the side is that let's not fall into the temptation to adopt the case and say, well, you know, this is what we want. This is what we are not going to settle for anything less. You know, because we as mediators often say to the client right at the beginning, well, what do you want out of today? And they say, well, to be honest, I want it over with. You know, how much how much I like my solicitor. The day when I don't have to phone him or her will be a happy day from my point of view. And so we forget that there is that agenda. And sometimes we as mediators, and you may have been coming onto this, Paul, would turn to the client at the end with of course the permission of those representing them, to say, okay, well, you've heard all this. You know, can we have you, before we pull on the plug on it, can we hear your view as to where you would like to go from here? You know, you've had fabulous advice because you've got great solicitors, which people always have, and I'm not undermining that. But what do you want out of this? And so the client, that's a good point that you raised. That client is central. As far as salami slicing, and I know, Paul, you don't want me to go off on my difference between positional bargaining and pragmatic and principled and all that sort of stuff. All I would say is, if what we ask ourselves mediators, we want people to move on to negotiation as soon as possible. If there is an issue that is preventing negotiation from progressing, then deal with it. If there isn't, my instinct would be to encourage people to know when to park things. Particularly, you both mentioned this. If it's something you're getting stuck on somewhere, then we would always say, and I know Paul would agree with me, the sooner parties can get to the realistic parameters of an overall figure, of a figure, the better, because both parties do this for a living. They know what those parameters are better than we do, and the sooner we can get there or thereabouts, the better. In terms of what if you're asked to do a global offer, well, Paul, the obvious answer is, of course, that it puts if it's a claimant solicitor, then it puts them in conflict with their own client, and the chances, therefore, of them accepting it are not that great. But I've been doing this a long time, like you, and there have been times when they have been happy to. And so I wouldn't, I would talk it through as usual with the defendants as to how, or the insurer or the NHS as to, how and why they're making that offer. But in certain circumstances, it can be appropriate, and in certain circumstances, it has been accepted. So I would just talk it through very carefully, because, as I said, of the obvious point that it puts the client in conflict with the solicitor, and that's not normally helpful.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, in such circumstances, how do you, as a claimant's mediation advocate, deal with it?
In terms of a global cost-inclusive offer?
Yeah.
Well, we huff a bit and we roll our eyes a bit, and we, my solicitors are generally not delighted by that sort of an offer, but sometimes, as Brian has said, that's the reality of it. And I think that, in a way, shows us one of the things of mediation. One of the beauties of mediation is that there are so many ways that we can reach a resolution that wouldn't necessarily be on the table if we were doing it another way. If a global offer comes across the table, then we sit and we think about it very carefully. It does potentially create this issue of conflict between a claimant solicitor and their client, but if we can cut through it in a way that minimizes that conflict. And if it looks like it's the only way to resolve the claim, then it has to be taken seriously and it has to be looked at very seriously. I have had success in persuading a defendant to move away from their sort of opening global offers. And sometimes if you just say, it's not going to happen, then of course, and you go back to the defendant with that, so look, that's not going to happen today, then, and ask them to think again, then I've definitely had success in doing that as well. So it doesn't mean to say it's the only way that a defendant is prepared to settle the claim. It's just one of the tools within their armory that they feel is suitable for discussion at that stage.
Yeah. So the next question I was going to ask was, in mediation, is there really any such thing as a final offer? I regard mediation as a flexible beast, and it starts when we're appointed as mediator, and it probably needn't end until there's a judgment if all else fails. So when is final, and how do you deal with that? Jennifer, do you want to comment on final offers?
Yeah, I think sometimes there does have to be a line put in the sand. I think you can get to a point where you're going round in circles, and frankly, it's clear that we can't share any more information, and we've maybe just got to a bit of an impasse. And it might be that it's a situation where, for example, the parties need to go away and actually get some further comments from their experts if there's going to be any further compromise on either side, something like that. Because again, as Elizabeth mentioned at the beginning, we usually quite often, hopefully, using mediation at a very early stage. So these are kind of very early stage investigations. There might be additional steps that are needed. And I think in those situations, it can be helpful for the claimant to know that perhaps the defendant has reached their limit for that day, because I think it helps the mediator understand and convey that to them. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't consider if you did make a counter proposal, but I think it maybe just helps draw a line. We're obliged to take further instructions if a claimant comes back with an offer, but I would say that it is quite rare if something like the NHS says it's a final offer that they will move, unless you'd have to be pretty close to that final offer, because we don't use it lightly, because obviously, as you say, the aim is resolution and we want to keep making that progress. But I do think sometimes there can be an issue that maybe it is a case where we just need some more evidence. We just can't justify that further increase without some more documentation or a further comment from the expert, for example, if it's about I don't know, the extent of future losses or the extent to which comorbidities or life expectancy, for example, where maybe to date everyone's kind of tried to take a view to get things through as quickly as possible, but actually the offer the claimant's keen on is a step too far without that further evidence. So I do think, you know, it's used carefully. I certainly think it should be used carefully. It isn't always, and I certainly, our ethos is not to use it as a threat. It's intended to just give an indication of, you know, we really are, and we will only do it if we really are at that end point for that day. I think, again, it's the point that Brian made of credibility. People who bandy about sort of final offer and don't really mean it, I think you lose credibility very quickly, and all that does is undermine anything you then make as an offer thereafter. And I think that's a really unfortunate situation to be in. So it's something we use very reluctantly, but only if we are sadly at a point where we think, and only after a lot of discussion with the mediator, actually. It's normally where we've had a big discussion with the mediator to get a feel for where the claimant's room is, to get, you know, indicate and explain why we may be getting to that point. And hopefully with a view to then it being understood that it's not this is the last go and issue court proceedings, we will never speak again. It's never that sort of final offer, but it might be a final offer for that day on the basis of the evidence we have before us. So I think it's about realising there has to be a limit sometimes on what you can achieve in a day. You can do your very best, and that's helpful for both sides, I think, sometimes.
And Elizabeth, do you use the expression final offer?
Yes, but I think what Jennifer said there is really important. It has to genuinely be your final offer. There's nothing worse than being in a situation where people are using the term and it's not, you can't trust them that they're using it appropriately. And if somebody says to me, if a defendant says to me, that is the final offer, I will take that at face value. And I think if we lose that trust in people utilising the phrase, then it really undermines the whole process. But yeah, if you've got to a point where you genuinely believe that on all of the evidence that is available, that is where you're at, then there is no harm in doing that on that day. Same for the defendant, from the defendant's perspective. And of course, we come back to that situation of what you're trying to do is to make your other side adjust their risk assessment. So, for example, if a defendant is coming into the mediation and they already have their bottom line absolutely, you know, sorted, they think, you've got to be able, in order for them to, for example, to go back and take some further instructions, you've got to give them good reason to. If it's just based on everything that they've already seen and already been, you know, trading some offers over the previous few months, they've got no reason to be rejudging where their bottom line is. You have to give them good reason to do so. Now, if that's the case, and you say, well, look, this is where we're at, go, you know, we're asking you to go and take further instructions on this, then I expect a defendant to take that and respond to that in a meaningful way.
And Brian, we've just skipped over one type of mediation, but I'd be interested in your views as mediator on it, and that's no offers mediation. So if you get instructed or as mediator, you've had your pre-mediation call and you're told it's going to be a no offers mediation, how do you set the parties up to deal with that?
Okay, before I do that, my usual way, just have a little digression. Again, coming out of a point that Jennifer made about experts, sometimes in the pre-mediation discussion, depending upon the case and how, if it's on causation or say, I might suggest to the parties it's sometimes worth seeing if your expert can be available at least at some time during the day by phone for a couple of minutes, because that can sometimes avoid a situation that Jennifer mentioned where you're saying, well, I've just heard something I haven't heard from the claimant's expert, or the other way around, and there's nothing we can do until we bounce it off ours. So it's sometimes just worth thinking about that before the mediation. In terms of no offer mediations, yeah, I mean, they're a fascinating animal, but and of course, first thing I want to know is whether the claimant is aware that that's the basis of mediation, the claimant and then those instructing them, and secondly, exactly as Elizabeth said, my pre-mediation chat would be very much about, okay, so what have we got that they don't already know? So have we got anything that they don't already know? Have we got an argument we can advance that they haven't already considered? And something as just, if as Elizabeth said, if they've made that decision based on the evidence they've got already, what else have we got, or could we potentially obtain that is going to be persuasive? And so my approach, I think it's inevitable. There are lots of issues in mediation, but in that case, obviously, whatever the sticking point is, liability, causation, or whatever, it is something that you're going to, the claimant is going to have to persuade the defendant there's a risk on, and the fact that it's a perfectly reasonable reason to have a mediation. I'm sure we as mediators would agree, providing everyone understands it, that you have those mediations for which have three possible results. Firstly, the defendant, dare I say it, the NHS resolution, have an opportunity to persuade the claimant that they actually aren't going to win. And that is just as realistic an outcome, and something that is just as worthy of progression as any other argument, because that might the claimant might think, okay, yeah, to be honest, if we're going to discontinue on a Cox, we're better off discontinuing now. So that's one outcome, and one that I've had. The other is that the defender, the trust then sees a client who's particularly impressive that they hadn't seen before. Here's an argument that is particularly impressive they haven't heard before, or just a bit more evidence, or just, I had one barrister who remained nameless at the end of it say, actually, Brian, I'm a lot, because we were doing the usual devil's advocate that the claimant would never know anything about. And he said, to be honest, Brian, I'm a lot less confident about this case now than I was before we started this. One of those really quite helpful outcomes. And so I've had them where the defendant has then changed their mind, made an offer. I've had them where the claimant is discontinued. And obviously we have the occasion one where, if you've got two QCs who are determined that, no, that's it, then it's not our job to force settlement. With our job, I'm sure you'd agree, Paul, is to open the door and explore every means possible towards resolution. Yep. That's all we can do. So that sort of, in a nutshell, sums up my approach. But I don't know if you've got something that you would want to add to that.
Well, I was going to bring in Jennifer, because as Brian says, we all accept that that's a valuable part of the mediation process in a certain group of cases. But I think you would accept that if the mediation is going to be set up on that basis, then it's set up from that basis from the outset, and the claimant knows that. So there's no false expectations.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. We would never turn up to a mediation having not put the other side on notice if we were intending to attend without any offers. And because, as you say, Brian, actually they can be really useful sessions to explore and narrow the issues, because it might be that actually there's a misunderstanding about a factual position, or that we need to understand the credibility of an expert position, and actually having that opportunity to then discuss it, for the claimant to have the addition of maybe counsel involved at that stage, and therefore have an extra sort of set of eyes on a case. Or perhaps it might be a situation where, sadly, as much as we do try to be collaborative with our opponents as much as possible, personalities don't always get on. And so sometimes having that ability to have an independent party, both in terms of mediator, but also legal counsel, can give another opportunity to actually sort of step away from the trenches, as it were, and look at the case in the round and where is this going, and is it going to get to trial? And, it's never taken lightly, because we appreciate that from a claimant perspective, being told to come to a meeting to talk about your case when the defendant is not proposing to make any offers can feel very disheartening. And also, arguably, why am I doing it? Why would I go through this process? But what Elizabeth mentioned right at the beginning actually was an important point, and maybe we'll talk about it if we've got time, is about the fact that mediation can have non-monetary elements to it. And quite often for claimants, we find that actually sometimes the process, of course, is a monetary element. They wouldn't go through all the pain of going through a court process if there wasn't compensation as a factor. But actually, it's about understanding what happened and why. Why did this happen to me? Have you listened to why this happened to me? And so even then, where it maybe isn't going to get resolved because we're going to compensate, but it might just give them that reassurance that it's been properly investigated. They have really looked at it. They've taken on board the points they've made, and then their legal team will have that opportunity to kind of take the claimant through that journey, that grieving process that Brian mentioned, via an independent mediator, so they don't feel that it's very sort of they're excluded from that process. If they've got to make that decision in the end and their solicitor's got to say to them, okay, I think, you know, we're not going to be able to take that on and take it any further forward, that is a really challenging conversation for solicitors to have. And I think sometimes going through that mediation process can just reassure everyone that it's the right advice, and we've gone through that process and the claimant is much more on board. So I think it definitely has a value, but it definitely has to be managed in the right way, because it is not an easy thing for a claimant to do. For legal teams, you know, it's just part and parcel of the process, but I think for claimants it's more challenging to understand that as a concept.
Yeah, and this is one example of where you would take the mediator into your confidence, and you'd be using the mediator effectively as a choreographer. And certainly I think Brian would agree with me, and I'm sure Elizabeth will as well. If that is going to be the case, then it really needs to be dealt with early on in the mediation. I have experience of advocates of both sides saying to me in mediations, oh, let's deal with those at the end. Well, I can tell you by the end, the claimant is absolutely frazzled. Everyone's tired, whatever the outcome is, whether it's been as expected or as unexpected, that it doesn't work. Setting the atmosphere right at the start, whether it leads to a monetary settlement, a greater understanding, or a continuing relationship, as you've said, about lessons learned and things like that. But it needs to be part of the pre-mediation discussion with the mediator, doesn't it, Brian? Because if it's suddenly on the plate on the day of the mediation, well, Jennifer's client can't react that quickly and wouldn't be expected to react that quickly. And it is a real danger of it going off, you know, half-mast, as it were.
Couldn't agree more. Any issues like that, please discuss with the mediator in advance in the pre-mediation conversation, so we can, as Paul said, choreography. And coming back to the point about notifying, stepping back a minute, notifying and claiming if there's no offers to be made. I just comment, Jennifer, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, not just let them know, but also remind them just before the mediation. It's quite important to say, you know, you should understand that our instructions have not changed. Otherwise, you know, the claimants and solicitors might think, oh, well, you know, they said that originally, but
yeah. And we're coming towards the end of our allotted time, but there is another form of mediation, of course, in all this, and that's the liability-only mediations. And just a quick word going around the table, don't you think that mediation for liability-only mediations can also end up, certainly it does in my experience, as a final settlement, providing the parties are prepared to consider that? They may not have schedules available and so on, but you know, you can think outside the box, maybe not even agree on percentages, but suddenly realize that there is a figure, there is a solution possible. I just wondered on your thoughts of that. Jen, do you want to come in on that?
Sure, yeah. I think there is a danger with that approach. I think that has to be carefully discussed. And the reason I say that is because if liability is the primary issue, you have to bear in mind that maybe at that point, the parties have only exchanged liability evidence, and certainly the defendant may not have, and even the claimant may not have, properly investigated quantum at that point. And so I think if there was a very significant litigation risk in either party's view, then you might be able to look at sort of a quantum position. But I suspect that might be the circumstances we talked about where you'd be looking at a cost-inclusive offer, for example. So that would be where you might be saying that your prospects of success are so low. I'm looking at this with a cost-inclusive perspective. That's not to say it's impossible, but I think it would be if, for example, a claimant was coming to that negotiation saying, look, I don't want to talk about percentages, actually, I just want to talk about final figures, I think that has to be communicated as well, because otherwise the defendant just isn't going to be there with that authority, and that's not something you're going to get short notice without having those investigations.
And the same applies the other way. If that is a possibility, raise it beforehand with the claimant side so that they may not have a particular report on that particular case, but they may well have similar cases, and they can use some thinking outside the box to get settlement that way. Well, I think we've reached our allotted time. It's my duty as chairman to thank you all for participating today. I'm not aware of any comments or questions, and someone will correct me if I'm
Paul,
wrong.
nothing in the live Q&A at the moment.
Good. So we've browbeaten everybody into submission, but we've hope the audience have found it interesting. The message is that whether negotiation is an art or a science, the secret of it being successful, I think we've all agreed, is preparation, preparation, preparation. And that is a nice segue for me to take into the title of our next webinar, which is on the 13th of November, when preparation is the topic. So we look forward to everyone joining us again then. And if you have any queries about anything we've raised today or about dispute resolution and mediations generally, do email registrar@trustmediation.org.uk. So thank you very much, everyone, and good day.